The drift wound up being deeper than it appeared from a distance, and so there was a problem. So what did I do? I walked up to the buildings. I went into the shed. I got a shovel. I came back down the lane, and I started shoveling snow out from underneath the car, thinking, I should be able to solve this. It's one of those times where, the more you tried to solve the problem, almost the worse it got. And so I eventually just gave up. I called one of the neighbors who came over. He brought his dad with him. He brought a couple more shovels, and he brought a tractor. And so between the three of us and the tractor, we did eventually get the car out. But I had to abandon my I can fix this myself mentality. As we wrap up this series, we come to a long passage that's a lot more serious than getting a car stuck in a snowdrift. Moses had returned to Egypt. He and his brother had announced to Pharaoh God's intention to free Israel from slavery. We've been working through those chapters up to this point. Pharaoh, of course, had retaliated. Initially, the Israelites had rejoiced at the news. The people had rejoiced. Pharaoh had retaliated. And then everything was pretty much worse at the end, or at least seemed worse at the end of all this than it had seemed at the beginning. Things were going nowhere. And in fact, it looked as if they were going backwards. I'm going to invite you, if you want, to turn with me Exodus chapter 5, starting verse 22. Now, I'm not going to read the whole passage that we're going to be touching on today because it goes through the middle of chapter 7. So it's a long passage. I will encourage you at some point in the next day or two to maybe read through all of it yourself on your own. What I am going to do is I'm going to point to a few places in this chapter and a half or so that hopefully will make sense to us and will give us just a little bit of a reminder where things are at as we come off Moses' first attempt to free the Israelites and the tremendous backlash that it created. All of this to hopefully set the stage for where we go starting next week as we begin looking at the plagues themselves. Now, I don't think that I'm exaggerating when I say that Israel at this point was despondent. Now, remember, Moses had come back. He had announced God's purpose to deliver the people from Israel. Pharaoh had retaliated, bricks without straw, and people got mad at Moses, and it was a whole big problem. And when we get to verses 21 and 22 of chapter 5, they are furious. The people are furious with Moses and Aaron. So Moses, afterwards, he consults with God a little bit more. God reiterates that his plan is indeed to get Israel out of Egypt into the promised land, and that plan, remains intact. When we get to chapter 6, verse 9, we read this: Moses reported this to the Israelites, but they did not listen to him because of their discouragement and cruel bondage. Now, we know as we read on, not just in the little incident we've already seen, but as we read on, we know that things between Moses and Israel were not always good. And most of the time the fault lay with Israel, not Moses. We touched briefly on the fact last week that Israel could be called stiff-necked, or was often called stiff-necked. There we go. One of the habits after the Exodus was murmuring, grumbling. We'll get to that after Easter when we get into some other things in Exodus. Now, it would be easy at this point, knowing the difficulty that existed at times between Moses and the people, to simply dismiss what we read in chapter 6, verse 9 as just Israel being Israel. But is that fair? I don't think it is. I don't think it is. How many of us have ever had the wind knocked out of us? Yeah, quite a few of us do. How has that happened for some of you? A collision, okay, with another person, I assume. Yep, okay. What else? Airbags go off. I have not had the pleasure of that experience. But yeah, the wind is gonna knock the wind out of you. You know, I'm sorry. Somebody else gonna say something? No? Okay, I'm hearing things. You know, I can think of a couple of times in my life when it's happened. One time was when I fell, and I don't remember what caused me to fall, but I fell hard on the ground, and that just knocked the wind out of me. The other time is when one of the class bullies punched me in the parking lot at school. If you've ever had the wind knocked out of you, though, you know it's scary. It's scary. You need to breathe. You're trying to breathe, but you can't breathe. That's, in a sense, what happened to the Israelites, at least emotionally. In fact, the verse could be translated sort of along those lines of having had the wind knocked out of them. Now, some folks suggest, too, that their response is just fatigue or impatience. Again, we could understand that. I mean, Israel had to be fatigued from the slavery, and they had to be impatient for it to end. We can understand that. And then after Pharaoh actually makes things worse for them, I can imagine their evaluation not only of their situation, excuse me, but I can imagine their evaluation of Moses. He had dramatically overpromised, spectacularly under-delivered. They've had the wind knocked out of them. Their spirits are crushed. They are despondent. And it is entirely, or it should be entirely, understandable. Speaking of Moses, something else that's understandable is that Moses was discouraged. Verses 22 23 of chapter 5, he asked God a hard question. He says, "Oh Lord, why have you brought trouble upon this people? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble upon this people, and you have not rescued your people at all." There's a question in there, but there's also kind of an accusation. Then when we get to verses 12 and 30 of chapter 6, he says something that's a bit reminiscent of his objections back in chapter 4. He says, and again he's speaking to God, "If the Israelites will not listen to me, why would Pharaoh listen to me, since I speak with faltering lips?" I mean, think about it. You know, if even the people I'm trying to help have turned on me, what's the point? Another thing, chapter 3, verse 18, so backing up just a little bit, chapter 3, verse 18, God tells Moses to take the elders of Israel with him, or him and Aaron, when they go to meet Pharaoh. But if you notice in chapter 5, verse 1, when Aaron and Moses actually go to the king, the elders are nowhere to be seen. There's a strain of thought in Jewish tradition that goes along these lines. The elders had started out on the journey to see Pharaoh, but as they got closer, they lost their nerve and they disappeared. A little bit like Jesus' disciples abandoning Jesus as he was going to the cross. Now, whether that's exactly what happened or not, we don't know. But the bottom line is that Moses and Aaron are facing the most powerful person in the world, and they are doing it alone. They're doing it alone. One last little point here. Chapter 7, verse 6 is where we learn Moses' age. How old was Moses at this point? 80. He's 80 years old. Now, I'm 1 or 2 years away from 80. Some days I feel like it's only 1 or 2 years away from 80, but I'm a little ways away from 80. But I could see Moses at this point pretty much saying or thinking at least something along these lines. I am just too old for this. In the Circle Maker, Mark Batterson writes that one reason many people get frustrated spiritually is that they feel like it should get easier to do the will of God, but the will of God doesn't get easier, the will of God gets harder. And Moses is learning that in real time. He's learning it in real time. Now, God never told him it was going to be easy. In fact, he had told him specifically that it was not going to be easy. But here then we see God kind of bucking him up again, doing maybe kind of the halftime pep talk, although it's not halftime yet. And so what does Moses do? He gets back to work. He gets back in the game. And despite the frustration, what we see in chapter 7, verse 6 is this, that Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord commanded him. Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord commanded him. It's understandable that Israel would have been despondent. It's understandable that Moses would have been discouraged because Pharaoh was recalcitrant. What does it mean to be recalcitrant? Those of you who are English majors out there. Stubbornly resistant to authority. Did you pull that up on your phone? Pardon? Just that smart. Okay, I'll take that one. Just that smart. Stubbornly resistant to authority, obstinate, uncooperative, disobedient. Now, we've already seen that about Pharaoh, not just the current Pharaoh, but the earlier Pharaoh. I mean, right from the start, chapter 3, with this Pharaoh, God had told Moses that Pharaoh wouldn't let the people go unless he was forced to let them go. Chapter 5, we have that whole bricks and straw fiasco. We talked last week about the contempt that Pharaoh had both for God and for Israel in chapter 5, verse 2, where Pharaoh says this, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Pharaoh's dug in his heels. And he's going to continue to dig in his heels, and he's going to dig and dig and dig until he's dug so deep that he buries himself. We actually see a not so subtle warning to him about that in chapter 7. You'll recall that when Moses was first getting his assignment from God, God gave him some signs to perform, including throwing the staff down on the ground, and it would become a snake. And so to demonstrate Moses and Aaron's authority, Aaron at this point threw down his staff, and it became a snake. Well, Pharaoh is not going to be outdone. So what does he do? He asks his magicians, his sorcerers, he probably doesn't ask them, he tells them to do the same thing. And they do. They throw their staffs down on the ground. They become snakes. At first, it looks like they've done the same thing, but it only looks like they've done the same thing. There's an old advertising line that goes back probably to the 1920s. It's like this: often imitated, never duplicated. Keep that one in mind as we get into the plagues. The magicians are just imitating it. They are not duplicating. And we know that because in the latter part of verse 12, chapter 7, it says this: but Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. Now, I kind of like this picture. Maybe you think it's stupid, but I think it's kind of fun. Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. What's the message? The message is this: Pharaoh, you can't win this. Our God is going to eat you alive, and you've been warned. But then what do we read in verse 13? Pharaoh's heart became hard, and he would not listen to them, just as the Lord had said. Israel was despondent, Moses was discouraged, Pharaoh was recalcitrant, but God was undeterred. God was undeterred. Proverbs 19:21 says, many are the plans in a person's heart, but it's the Lord's purpose that prevails. Now, sometimes when I'm thinking about that verse, I think about it in a couple of different ways. I think, for instance, okay, God knows better than I, which is pretty obvious. Another thing is that God's not going to let me get in the way of what he wants to do, or you could also think he's not going to let somebody else get in the way of what he wants to do. Think about the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul, at one point, he had been determined to go to Asia to preach the gospel. That's the Roman province of Asia, not the continent of Asia necessarily. He was determined to go to Asia to preach the gospel. What did God do? Sent him to Ephesus instead. Now, it was not wrong for Paul to want to go to Ephesus. I mean, what's his point? His purpose is to preach the gospel, to share the good news of Jesus with folks. The only problem was that was Paul's plan, not God's plan. In Exodus, Paul's purpose, his desire was not bad. Nothing wrong with it. But when we're in Exodus thinking about Pharaoh, Pharaoh's purposes, his intentions are nothing but wrong. He is a powerful man with no redeeming character qualities whatsoever. He is cruel, he is contemptuous, he is determined to do evil. And think about it. If God's not going to let his friends, like the Apostle Paul, just kind of do whatever they want, he's definitely not going to let his enemies, like Pharaoh, do whatever they want. Isaiah 54, this is obviously a little while later. Isaiah 54, God is speaking of the future glory of Israel, of Zion, excuse me. He's speaking about his love for Zion, his compassion toward them, his redemption of them. And here's what he says in verse 17. He says, no weapon forged against you will prevail. It is a reminder of God's ultimate control over all things. Now, if we're honest, there are times where we can feel like Israel, we can feel despondent. There are times where we, like Moses, could feel discouraged or be discouraged. Hopefully we're never like Pharaoh, recalcitrant. But in the end, God is determined to deliver on his purposes. He is undeterred. And in the big scheme of things, we know what his purposes are. That is to bring a lost, hurting, broken world back to himself. In terms of his people, we know that it's to bless them and to protect them in every way. And we know that in our own lives, in our individual lives, he has purposes for us that fit in that bigger picture. And sometimes we don't necessarily see what they are. We feel like, well, they can't be happening. But they are, and they will. And we see that here in Exodus. And what Pharaoh is going to learn reluctantly is something we need to embrace joyfully. And that is that we can't keep God from his purposes. We can't keep God from his purposes. Exodus is one of two great salvation interventions in the Scripture. It is the great one in the Old Testament. The other great salvation intervention is in the New Testament. It's the incarnation, the life, death, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. For the Israelites who had been trapped in slavery, the freedom that they received was freedom from physical bondage. For all of us who know Jesus Christ, the freedom we receive is the freedom from spiritual bondage and its implications. No weapon forged against you will prevail. I can't wonder sometimes if maybe Jesus didn't think about that as he was going to the cross and as he was hanging on the cross. Think about it. He had every possible weapon aimed at him that you could think of. And I'm not talking just about Roman spears and swords. He had the whole army and arsenal of the whole army and arsenal of hell trained on him. And for a brief moment, it looked as if they had prevailed. It looked as if they had prevailed. But they hadn't. No weapon formed against us will prevail. God's desire for everyone, whether it's us or people we know or people we don't know in faraway places, people who have not been born yet, his whole purpose is to redeem and to bless. Sometimes it's hard when we look at the world around us to see how that's happening. But it is. And sometimes when we look at our own lives, it's hard to see how that's happening for any number of reasons. God had warned Moses that it was not going to be easy. Jesus has warned us the same thing. John 16:33, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. Aaron's staff, the staff of God, actually, we talked about that a couple of weeks ago, the staff of God swallowed up the magicians, demonstrating God's superiority. God was undeterred by the worst that Pharaoh could throw at him. He is undeterred by the worst that anything can come at us. As we come to the table again this morning, this table reminds us of that. It reminds us of that. It proves just how determined God was and is to bring a lost, hurting, and broken world back to himself, just how determined he was to free us and others from spiritual bondage and its implications. How determined he is to bless, protect, empower, and provide. He will not be deterred. He cannot be stopped. He will prevail no matter how hard it can be in the moment to see that. He will prevail but all because and only because of Jesus.